Currently, we have an open class where you can learn everything about Brazil in World War II. And in the last class I taught to this group, we discussed the war in North Africa. Everything that happened in the Mediterranean before the FEB joined the campaign was really cool. Everyone really enjoyed it. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of that class so you can get a sense of what happened. All right, so as I said, we start on November 8, 1942. In fact, it's an event we've already talked about, right? In lesson number 2, we already discussed this event here, Operation Torch, right? Which changed a lot for Brazil, the relationship between Brazil and the United States. And it's Operation Torch that will really start the sequence of events that will lead to the creation of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, right? So, on November 8, 1942, in Lesson 2, there's even a map there if you want to look at it, showing where the 3 task forces landed, right? They landed in Morocco and Algeria. North Africa, as we're talking about, stretches from Morocco on its west coast all the way to Egypt on its east coast, right? The entire stretch of North Africa is made up from west to east of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, 3 French colonies. Then you have Libya, which was an Italian colony, and finally Egypt, which was a British colony. So, while most of the war had been going on since June 1940, there in the eastern part, right, in the so-called Eastern Desert between the Italians and the British, in Egypt, the war will take in its final phase in North Africa, a more western turn, that is. It will move into the territories of the North African French colonies. So, Operation Torch will take place over a few days, about 4 days, right? 3 or 4 days after the defeat of the Africa Corps at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, which was Rommel's furthest advance into Egypt, right? That way then, the Italo-German armies are pulled back. They're pushed to the west, right? They're pushed to the west, so they lose not only Cyrenaica, but also Tripolitania. And they end up digging in there, right? Creating a fortress in Tunisia. But let's go. This is Operation Torch. It's going to be a big partnership between the United States and the United Kingdom. The United States, even though they had basically entered the war for less than 11 months, right? But about 11 months before, because they entered on December 7, 1941, it took all that time, right? 11 months to be able to get organized. We have to imagine that the whole process of national mobilization happened during those 11 months, and also that whole phase of organizing the convoys in the Atlantic, right? The escort of the convoys, which is extremely necessary, is fundamental for a transatlantic operation like the one we're seeing here. So that's the objective of the War Department, right? There in the United States, from the Army Chief of Staff, General Marshall, the goal was to go straight ahead, right? The fight against the Germans, and just like the American Expeditionary Force fought in World War I, Marshall knew that the defeat of the Germans, it would only happen with an invasion across the English Channel, right? An invasion across the narrowest part connecting England and France, right? By invading France, you liberate Paris, liberate France, and head straight to Germany. It's the shortest path to German defeat. But when Marshall and his delegate, at that time his favorite protege, General Dwight Eisenhower, right? They arrive in London and go to confer with the senior British commanders, right? They will be strongly advised against pursuing this strategy in 1942. Why is that? Because we have to remember that the British, remember from our first class? The British were still in shock, even 2 years later. They were still in shock from the defeat they suffered at Dunkirk. In other words, the number of British troops. The British war industry was still trying to make up for the losses, still trying to make up for the disaster at Dunkirk. So, the entire British Army. Now it's supporting operations in the Eastern Desert, right? Over there in Egypt against Rommel, even receiving a lot of American equipment to make up for their own shortcomings, right? From their own industry. Let's never forget that the main beneficiary of Lend-Lease was the United Kingdom, okay? With about twice the amount of equipment received by the Soviet Union itself. So you see that Dunkirk was really a hammer blow that they never recovered from. Yeah? So what's going to happen next? The British generals will advise the Americans to first launch an offensive in a place less protected, less guarded than the English Channel, right? Let's also remember that here, about 3 months before this, in August 1942, the disaster had happened, right? Of the British landing in Dieppe, right? With tank support and all, and it was a big disaster. This was the second disaster of 1942 with British amphibious operations, since the first one was Saint Nazaire, right? At the port of Saint Nazaire, which was also a big disaster. So the British are very wary of the German coastal defenses, and they don't even want to think about making a third attempt through the Channel in that year, 1942. So this makes the Americans, Eisenhower, listen to the British and say, you guys are right, aren't you? So really, we're in a hurry to end this, but we have no experience to finish it. So let's try to do a practice operation, right? Let's do an operation in a less obvious region. So this operation takes place in North Africa. Why? Because even with the victory at El Alamein, we know that when this operation here was decided, there hadn't even been the Battle of El Alamein yet. So, and it's curious that this operation was decided in July 1942, just so you have an idea of how drawn out things were, right? The negotiations to get to this point. So the torch, it was put together, man, in about 90 days it was put together, and that's really fast. This makes it very clear how the Russian planning impacted the rather flawed execution of Operation Torch. Yeah, but while it was being planned, there wasn't even the Battle of El Alamein yet. Rommel was still on the offensive into Egypt. So this operation here was planned as a relief operation against Axis forces in North Africa. That's it. Relief in favor of Montgomery in Egypt. But in the last days before, right, by the time this was coming to an end, the British managed to turn things around there in Egypt and were now expelling the Germans from Cyrenaica, right? Well, very well. Government-wise, right, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, he liked that, right? Because it was kind of a safe bet. It was a safe bet for Roosevelt's political agenda. Because, you know, it really wasn't expected that it could end in disaster. Because the North African coast of these French colonies was defended only by French troops, right? Vichy troops, right? Which were like a kind of ally of the Germans there, but didn't have much real combat power, right? Not very strong, no. And it was also a kind of maturity test for the American army itself. Why? Because since World War I, more than 20 years earlier, they hadn't been fighting, right? They had had only very brief experience in the Pacific. 3 months before that, in Guadalcanal, it was very limited, so they really didn't know what was going to happen. Once such a large number of troops was landed in a transcontinental theater of operations. So on November 8th, with some intelligence operations even happening in the days before, right? With Mark Clark even being inserted by submarine on the North African coast to talk to French delegates and negotiate a kind of ceasefire even before the operation began.
É,
Patton says in his memoirs that the sea was,
é,
strangely calm that day, right? They found the sea unusually calm before the landing, and this was taken as a sign of something positive. And even though, when we read Patton's memoirs, he only really tells what is his own point of view, right? In other words, he's a very aggressive guy. He's someone who wants to see the fighting moving forward. When you read post-war sources, especially about the logistics and support behind all this, here you'll see that it was a big like quagmire, right? Because these soldiers landed, but they couldn't move very far, even with reduced resistance from the French on the beaches. So these people had major problems with organization, landing, and supplies. It was a huge mess, so much so that they couldn't really get closer, go deeper, or open up the exit routes from the landing zone, and therefore they lost. The race for Tunis. This episode, called The Race for Tunis, is when, in the wake of the defeat at El Alamein, while Operation Torch was happening over there in Morocco and Algeria, Hitler also sent reinforcements to North Africa. He sent several Italian and German reinforcements to North Africa, including the first and only Tiger tank company that went down to North Africa, right? So actually, who won the race for Tunis? For the capital of Tunisia, right? Which was like this, a point very close to the tip of Sicily. And that allowed for a much shorter supply route and therefore much safer for the Axis soldiers, right? It was the Germans. The Germans took that initiative. Rommel entrenched himself. The Mareth Line, which is in the southeast of Tunisia, managed to stop Montgomery there and also stop the Americans in the west of Tunisia. So the battlefront became paralyzed in December 1942.
42.
The result of this was really, quite disappointing, right? So, at the Casablanca Conference, which brought together Roosevelt, Churchill, and de Gaulle in January 1943, the three great leaders there, along with Stalin's delegate, right? Stalin, of course, wasn't going to fly from the Soviet Union all the way to Morocco just to meet with the Allies. In the middle of the Stalingrad operation, Stalingrad was still happening at the time of the Casablanca Conference. It decided to continue action in the Mediterranean. You should pay attention to Marshall's initial objective, which was unexpectedly to launch an invasion across the English Channel, still in 1942. He is convinced to carry out a test landing in a secondary area, and the result is so poor. It's so discouraging that they say the following: let's stay here in the secondary area to see if we can get a little more experience, to see if we can improve, so that after that they can go to the English Channel. So, at the Casablanca Conference, they decide to continue the war in the Mediterranean. What does that mean? It means Italy, right? It can only mean Italy because there's no way you can have control of North Africa and want to invade southern France directly without going through Italy. So with that, they decide to knock Italy out of the war and isolate Germany, okay? Yeah, with that, they also hope to get bases for the American bombers to more easily reach targets in southern Germany, right? They were having a big problem at that time because there were no fighter escorts that could take these bombers based in England all the way to targets in southeastern Germany. Very well. So what happened, just so you know, was that in February of 43, the Battle of Kasserine Pass took place. And in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Rommel, who was already extremely worn out with very little supply, managed to achieve a rather embarrassing victory over the Americans, right? Embarrassing for the Americans, a surprising victory over the Americans who had superiority in resources, right? They had many more tanks on the ground. So they are going to be defeated in the Battle of the Pass, Kasserine, and that leads to a shakeup, right? Marshall gets furious. He initiates a shakeup in the command of the American Second Corps, right, which is the vanguard force of the army there in North Africa. And it's in this episode that the commander of the Second Corps, General Lloyd Fredendall, is replaced by someone everyone knows, General George Smith. Patton Jr. So George Patton takes command of the Second Corps, and that's what catapults Patton's career, right? We'll see that in the meantime, while the battle remains undecided, it's at a standstill. So the Americans are suffering setbacks on the ground. The situation in the air is totally different, man. Allied air power really comes in kicking down the door. And there are a lot of bomber groups, a lot of attack groups, a lot of fighter groups that get there and start operating. And these guys sweep through. They really managed to completely eliminate the presence of the Luftwaffe and the air network here in North Africa, right? And this will support Marshall's thesis that he really has to emphasize air power. And again, we can't forget that the United States Air Force wasn't independent. It was part of the Army, so it depended on Marshall himself, the only general. He had to choose between ground troops and air troops, and Marshall gradually started favoring the air troops more and more. Okay? So that's one of the things that will favor the creation of the FEB, as we've already seen in the previous class, right? In class number 2, yeah? So... Tunisia, keeping Tunisia for the OKW, for the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command back in Germany, keeping Tunisia, the logistical cost of keeping those troops fighting there in Tunisia will become unsustainable because the losses really start piling up, especially with the arrival of a very, very strong American air contingent. So, in the month of April, right, already in March, Hitler decides that it's really not possible to hold that position anymore, that it's time to start retreating, right? It's already time to start preparing the withdrawal of troops from North Africa. So, the final offensive will be launched in April and May of 1943.
43.
Patton starts by commanding this offensive, but he will be pulled to the rear, because Patton will take command of an army, right? He is a corps commander. He will receive the Army Command, which is the 7th Army, and the one who will take over the 2nd Corps will be General Omar Bradley. It's Bradley who will actually finish the last offensive, the final offensive, against the Axis in May 1943. The surrender will take place on May 13, 1943, right, with the surrender of Marshal Giovanni Messi. Giovanni Messi was the commander of the 1st Italo-German Army, right? And he will surrender to General Bernhard Freyberg of the New Zealand Corps. So the war in North Africa will come to an end on May 13, 1943, and then an episode will happen shortly after on June 11, which is the capture of the island of Pantelleria. The island of Pantelleria is located very close to here. To the Tunisian bridgehead here, look. Between Tunisia and Sicily, you know? It's a small Italian island, but it had a heavily fortified air base, so it was kind of an Italian fortress in the middle of the Mediterranean there. And this island, it surrenders solely due to the use of American air power. It's called Operation Corkscrew. They get bombed so much that the Italian delegation there decides to surrender before the amphibious landing, which was scheduled to happen. So, what did that do to Marshall's belief? It made it even stronger. So that means air power is really what we need. So Marshall keeps believing more and more and prioritizing air power even more, right? And that's what's going to limit the American Army to 90 divisions and will end up favoring the creation of the FEB, as we've already mentioned. So did you like the content? Do you want to keep up with not just this lesson, but the many others as well? There will be more this week. So sign up for our course Brazil in World War II. You can pay with Pix, or split it into up to 12 installments on your card. So the payment will be this small. Look. And you can find the link in the description or by scanning the QR code that's on the screen. So don't waste time. Come study with us. I'll be waiting for you there.